Sagoli, Nadio Liwis, Oniada Aga ni Wugnifta ni Wagi Taloda, Luxadi ni Yugyaks. And I just said, greetings, what is the news? I am Oneida, I am people of the Standing Stone, I am part of the Turtle Clan, and my Oneida name is Luxadi, which means a good man. And you'll notice that during that introduction, and some introductions during last week's presentations, and even in some of the books that I have here, a lot of people, Indigenous people, will introduce themselves by their tribe first with a location to geographic space, then their clan, and then themselves. And that's also a reflection of a collectivistic mentality versus more of an individualistic mentality. And I start by that way just to give you more of a framing into that Indigenous knowledge system that we'll be working on today. So this is Indigenous Perspectives in College Student Development Theory, and I am Thomas Reed, and let's get into it. So an overview today, we're going to go over a summary of the theory, brief context of how the theory came to be, some critiques of the theory, a few references for you to learn more about it, and then lastly, the theory and practice in higher education. So an overview of the theory, and as you all saw from the one page where I posted, that Indigenous students are indeed unique, as are every student from different heritages, but specifically the things to focus on for Indigenous students are the Indigenous paradigms, Indigenous knowledge systems, in this form of decolonization. And decolonization is this idea of taking back, reclaiming, renaming these sacred spaces, these sacred traditions that had been taken away since colonization in around 1492 and on to this day. So that's the basic notion of decolonization. And it is agreed upon by many scholars that higher education is still a contested terrain for Native American students, as it's a predominantly white institution, so we know for people of color it's not always made for them, and particularly for Native American students, some of the philosophies and the perspectives are very clashing with that. Tribal crit is something that was mentioned, and this is it builds on critical race theory, and it's speaking back to colonization and saying how different systems of oppression are still taking place, different thought processes are still not being taken seriously, and this is what tribal crit is trying to bring that Indigenous philosophy more to light in an academic realm. And some of the cultural specifics for Native American people, it is made, even in our readings for SDC, it talked about how there's no one specific culture for all Native American tribes. How at the time of colonization, there was about 2,000 tribes in what is North America today. 567 of those are federally recognized today. Each of those having their own language, their own culture, their own creation story. And many of those are as different from English as to Mandarin. So when you say a Native American culture, it's like, yes, and, like, and what else about their culture? So that's one thing that they recognize as well, too, in the literature. One also important thing is how Native Americans, they understand with four parts: their mind, body, emotion, and spirit. This is just a generalizability there. But you see the medicine wheel, which you've probably seen before. This is one of the things that it stands for, is the mind, body, emotion, spirit. It also stands for the four directions. And as my relatives have told me, it also stands for the different races and different nations for all the people. That's what I've been explained by some of my relatives. Also, the sociopolitical identity is different and unique. And sociopolitical identity is many times Native Americans are dual citizens. So such as myself, I'm a member of the United States, but I'm also a member of the Oneida Nation. So it's you not only have a race, a heritage, and a culture, but you're also a sociopolitical entity of sovereignty, self-determination, which is an era in our federal government since 1972, where Native Americans work to determine their own fate, so to speak, as a government, as a nation. And before the era, that was extermination. Before that was extermination. So self-determination is our current era. And sovereignty is exercised by people in everyday settings, but it's having that knowledge is an important base for your sociopolitical knowledge. 7 generations is a term also, this idea that 7 generations before us is what allows us to live in the way we live today, and that everything we're doing today is going to affect 7 generations ahead of us. So what we kind of consider sustainability, this concept, this is a very old Native concept that's been going on for many generations. And in that, it's also, time is very much more of a circular concept than more of a linear Gregorian calendar. And the idea that the past is very much affecting us here now 7 generations ago, and our actions are affecting 7 generations to come. So it's very much a different concept of time as well, too. And Perry Horse recognizes this as well, too, this best part of this consciousness. And in part of this consciousness are 5 different lenses, one of those being language, the other being a genealogical heritage as an Indian. And Indian here, this moniker, this term is used interchangeably with Native American, Indigenous, Indian are some of the terms used. Embracing an Indigenous philosophical worldviews, the extent to which someone sees themselves as an Indian, and one's status as a member of an officially federally recognized tribe. And those are Perry Horse's 5 lenses. I thought this was interesting. I was shared by one of my relatives recently, and it's by an activist and artist named Greg Deal. He said, "Today I was asked, what is most important to Indigenous people? The land, protecting traditions, your language, or your people?" And I told him those are all the same things. And those kind of seem like different concepts, but for Indigenous people, those are very much synonymous. Those are very much related concepts in land, protecting traditions, language, people, all very much the same thing. So some contextual history of the theory is it's very new. As Cheryl, in the first day of class when I asked about it, she's like, well, this is just kind of happening now. So in the book, in our SDC, there were some short sections about it, and in this text as well too, I pass around this college student development theory. Had a few sections on it as well too. So this is kind of our era of what's happening now, and also just in recognizing the Kumeyaay people for whose land we're on as well too. This is a nice thing that was given away last week to me for Indigenous Peoples Day, so you want to pass around and look at that as well too. Maybe I'll start it over here. You can just kind of check it out. But yeah, so it's very new. It's happening right now, essentially. It's very much a different paradigm that we've been looking at Indigenous philosophy before and kind of taking it seriously in academia. A lot of this is coming from 2005 or newer. And at the era of finding out what is happening to Indigenous students going through becoming a college student, that's kind of happening now, or research into it. And it's a quick side bit story. During my undergraduate at Pepperdine University, I very much wanted to learn about Native American peoples, and they didn't have a class for it, so they gave me a directive studies class with someone who had a doctorate, an expert in the field. And he was an older white male, and when we were talking about Native American studies, I said, well, it really was genocide what happened to Native American people. And he said, well, that word didn't exist back then, so that wasn't really how it happened. I was like, well, a rose by any other name would still be a rose. Like, just because the word didn't exist doesn't mean it didn't happen to them. He said, well, I think you're just getting too emotionally involved. You're just too emotionally invested. And this was less than a decade ago. It's about a decade ago, so this is 2010. So it's obviously, we've come a long way in terms of being now at that same university too. There's a Christopher Columbus statue right in front of the Humanities building. And I remember my grandma seeing campus, she was horrified at it. She was being an elder in our tribe and full Oneida woman, horrified that this would be in front of there. And I remember trying to get the school to change it, and no one really took it seriously. And it was, I think 2016, there's some other students came forward, and now they moved the Columbus statue to Italy to, I guess, put Columbus there. To honor him in that way, I guess. But this definitely matters. So being like last week, when we could have Indigenous Peoples Day at a Matsuum Crossing, that's a really big deal. Having an Indigenous liaison, having a campus and faculty administrators that care about us and care about Native American students really matters a lot. So we have come a way as faculty, as an institution. We still have a long ways to go as well too. So in one part of the history here is the boarding school era. This is really important to understanding Native American relationships to school. And they mentioned it briefly in some of the people talking last week about what the boarding school era was. 1870s and 1990s, really the worst era was up to the 1920s through the 1870s, was really kind of the toughest time. It took place in the US and Canada, and it plays a large role in the U.S. perspective, the Indigenous students' perspective of education. So here's a quote from the superintendent of Carlisle Indian School, which my great-grandfather attended Carlisle Indian School about a century ago. And this is what it said. He is speaking to one of the chiefs and trying to get them to come to boarding school, get the kids to come to boarding school. Spotted Tail, you are a remarkable man. You are such an able man that you are the principal chief of these thousands of your people. But Spotted Tail, you cannot read or write. You claim that the government has tricked your people and has placed the lines of your reservation a long way inside of where it was agreed that they should be. You signed that paper, knowing only what the interpreter told you it said. If anything happened when the paper was being made up that changed its order, if you had been educated and could read and write, you could have known about it and refused to put your name on it. Do you intend to let your children remain in the same condition of ignorance in which you have lived, which will compel them always to meet the whiter man at a greater disadvantage to an interpreter as you have to do? As your friend, Spotted Tail, I urge you to send your children with me to this Carlisle school, and I will do everything I can to advance them in intelligence and industry in order that they may come back and help you. So this was the kind of the supposed promise of this idea, and even then it's very much a speaking down upon them, condescending, very much so. And the reality, with what the motto of the school was to kill the Indian, save the man. This is the whole idea, was to get rid of their culture completely. By doing this, Native American students were forbidden to speak their tribal languages and were beaten or had mouths washed out with soap if they did. A lot of Native American students from the same areas were put in different schools as well too, just so they couldn't communicate with one another whatsoever. It's something I learned about recently. Native American students' hair was cut off as soon as they were taken from their families and placed in the schools. A lot of Native American people and Native American men, your hair is your tradition, your connection to your ancestors, to all living things, very much part of your spiritual identity. And when it only really is cut off when someone close to you passes away. So for a lot of these kids, these students who didn't know English, all they knew was that their hair got cut off, they were taken away from their parents. A lot of them thought their parents had died, or that that's what they understood because they didn't understand any English. So it's very much a very traumatic experience, extremely. And also sexual abuse was rampant. I've heard different interviews and different people talk about it happening to 98% or more of male and female students. So it was a very tough time. And this is what intergenerational trauma, if you've ever heard that term, is where it's passed down. So intergenerational trauma means, like for instance, my grandma was never told by her dad, my great-grandfather, that she was loved by him. And she knew she was loved, but he was never able to verbally articulate that, or different things of being able to hug her, show her affection. And in doing so, she's a very loving woman, and she was able to really much overcome that and showing love and affection. But for many families, that's very much, they're not able to show love and affection to the next generation, and they're not able to show love and affection to the next generation as well too, or just be able to articulate your feelings, this trauma that's not recognized by any means. In no school are we taught this really hardly at all growing up, and it's a big part of Native Americans in understanding our relationship to education, just first and foremost. And from there, the intergenerational trauma, even so, like my grandma, she was saying even growing up, people would say if you were going to school that they'd call you an apple because you're red on the outside but you're white on the inside. You're going to a white man's institution. Like, why would you want to do that? So even to this day, we've come a long way in terms of now, just now being like, oh, academia is a place for Indigenous people to kind of reclaim that space and that knowledge. So it's an exciting time to be a part of, but just it's important to know the history as well too. Here's an important thing as well too is even when they were taking away students for boarding schools, it was a full Indians as well too. And something I thought was interesting was they would also take up to 1/4 people, or that's what so anyone who's 1/4 would be taken as well too. To put that in perspective, I'm 1/4, so my mom's half, so I would have to go to boarding school if I was alive a century ago, which is a pretty scary thought and pretty wild to think about in terms of putting that in perspective. And it was for students 14 to 18, and some of them were older if they're for certain circumstances. Here, my great-grandfather, at one point, he ran away from school, so a lot of Native American students would run away from school as well, too. This is from the Carlisle Archives. They released those a few years ago. It's by one of the administrators letting them know, Anderson Cornelius is a deserter from the country and should be disciplined accordingly. So you can tell it wasn't exactly a voluntary thing or an optional thing to go to this school. If you weren't there, he eventually returned to school and finished his education, but that was mostly because he had to, I guess. It wasn't really because he wanted to. But that's definitely a lot of Native students as well too. They ran away and some of them passed away, so it's a very tough thing. Here's a picture as well too of some Native students, they're hiding under their beds as the Bureau of Indian Affairs people are coming to their house to try to take them to school. So some of their families would hide to stay away from them as well too. One of my cousins had made this book recently, and this is one of my resources as well too. Has some pictures and different things. It's historical fiction, but it's all based on actual events and things that happen, but it just kind of fills in some of the gaps and has illustrated as well too. So some of the critiques is that there is limited information, as we know. It's just kind of now happening, so there's only so much that you can critique as far as the literature that is present. So we're going in the right direction, but there's still a long ways to go. One thing that is recognized in the literature is a limitation that each tribe is going to be so different in each of their own cultures, so it's going to be very unique. One example of this is I'm part of the Oneida Nation. We're matriarchal, so everything's passed down from your mother's side. But someone like Lakota, you would be patriarchal, so everything's passed down from your father's side. This also matters for which ceremonies, what traditions you take place in, what your role is, your gender roles in different communities. If they have gender roles, that's kind of all going to depend on the different tribe as well too. So that's one kind of critique and limitation, is that it's just so nuanced between different tribes. So it could be more specific. And as our friend Ariella tells us, hey, there's room for you to write one. So there is more room to write about this, which is exciting. So some more references as well too. This book is called The Sacred Ways of Knowing. This is a really interesting book because it talks about kind of Native American ways of learning as well too. So not just like your formal education in school, but some of your education as a Native American person. For some people that maybe came on with spiritual gifts or different things, it talks about in there as well too. And particularly kind of sometimes what happened between the ages and college ages, between sometimes 18 to 22, sometimes younger, different ages. But sometimes that Native American education kind of overlapped with your formal education as well too. So that's just an important text in case you were interested in learning more about kind of Native American perspectives and traditions as well too. Another book, Oneida Lives, Long Lost Voices of the Wisconsin Oneidas. That's an interesting book. You can find it on Amazon. It has my great-grandfather and others talking about their boarding school experience and talking about just life as well too as a Native American person, but particularly the boarding school experience is something to learn from. Some Indigenous research journals as well too. Alternative and American Indian Quarterly are a couple to pull from. I know Cassie, you were great to put a comment recognizing that Beyond the Asterisk. What's the full name of that book?
I forgot the full name of it, but Beyond the Asterisk is the main, and then there's a longer
subtitle.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to looking at that one as well too. I just saw it last night, or just saw that you put it. But definitely that's just that notion of Beyond the Asterisk. Because a lot of times for Native American people in quantitative studies, there's not enough of you to make up a study, so you're deemed an asterisk. And then in qualitative studies, we have even different terminology of saying, well, don't go native, don't go too far into your research. Even that jargon is really kind of from an idea of don't connect too much with the native people, I suppose. So it even has bias in different things that we have in education now. So that's kind of Beyond the Asterisk, what came to mind when I saw that. How it can be used is through supporting growth, just like we've talked about in different things, supporting growth. I know for me, I'm going to be a mentor right now to some of these young students who are freshmen in colleges now. They were, I got to coach them at about the U13 level for lacrosse, and now they're all about freshmen in college. Some of them going farther away to from the reservation, some going closer. And just be able to help support and grow them as who they are as Oneida people, as Native American person, just as a person going through college and learning and developing, and just trying to help and support them. Right now, a lot of them are digital natives, so they're all very much social media savvy, so I connect with them a lot through Instagram, Snapchat. That's kind of my way of checking up on them kind of on a daily basis, but just kind of talking and connecting with them, giving them support of a community, even if it's farther away. That's kind of what I'm doing right now. I think someone pointed out as well, too, how a lack of higher education role models can be very tough for Native American students, and just feeling like you don't belong there if you're looking around, like, well, I don't see anyone else that looks like me, or I don't see anyone else that thinks like me, why would I, like, how do I feel supported here? So that could definitely be a tough thing. So I think that what we can do as practitioners, whether we're Native American or not, is just to give them a space of support and to try to create community building programs for retention. And this is, I think, for Native American students, but for a lot of students, just a sense of feeling included, like you belong, like you're understood. I think those are all important things to keep in mind when working with Indigenous students and populations. And Kindness and Bernard in 1991, they brought up 4 R's, which are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, which I think are important things to think about as well too. Further, the theory and practice, it's important to recognize when Indigenous students need to return home for ceremony. And this is an important point because in SDC and certain other texts we have, it talks about how it's important for the students to spend, I think Park says it as well too, spend as much time on the campus as possible to kind of develop and to kind of develop yourself. Whereas some of the Indigenous theory would say it's really important for Native students to go back and get involved with your family's traditions as well too, your tribal traditions as well too, if that's something that's important to your development or your culture as well too. So even though some other theories would say that's not a good thing, this was actually saying that it still supports their overall growth, absolutely. And even if you don't, if they're, let's say someone's farther away from school, they don't have their tribe or their family next to them, even creating familial traditions within them, just being like creating family roles at that space can be a thing that you can do as well too, to help support Native American Indigenous students. That family relations is very a familiar thing and a comfortable thing. Another point to recognize here is being Native enough. Oh, and actually, I'm sorry, just before we go to the last one as well too, engaging the student's family as well. So having a student do a project that's also working with their family or with their tribe can be a great way of recognizing that wisdom and then bringing that into the academic space as well too, and making them feel heard and understood. So it's just a thought. One point as well too, the theory and practice, it talks about in some of the texts being passed around as being Native enough, and this idea of expectations from others of what they expect a Native American person to look like. I'm sure no one thought I was Native American the first day of class, so I would guess, I don't know, I would guess, but that's fair, because I'm English and Irish as well too, so more than fair. But yeah, so being Native enough of how other people perceive you. And I remember one time I was doing a Native American political leadership program at George Washington University during my undergraduate, and I was feeling kind of out of place. I was doubting myself a lot, and I went to one of my mentors in the program, and I told her, Colonel, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not sure if I should be an Indigenous leader. I'm not full Indian. I didn't grow up on the reservation. There's a lot of people who look more Native American than me for sure. So I don't know why I would be this Native American leader. And she says, oh, TJ, she says, people are always going to say something. She's like, I'm full Navajo. I grew up on the reservation. She said, I went to Harvard to get my undergraduate and master's, and I came back and people says I'm not Native enough anymore because I went and got a white man's education. She's like, people are always going to say something. She's like, just be like a duck. Let that be water off your back. Let it roll off. Just know what you're doing. You're trying to help people, and keep doing that. Keep doing what you're doing. So just kind of having that. Everyone's going to deal with that identity issue differently as well too. And so that's something to recognize. The expectations of the Native community, non-Native community, authenticity. Some of the authors they talk about as well too, they're writing a letter to they're trying to make a point of story as theory. So they're telling this story of writing letters to one another. And they're both Haudenosaunee, both part of the Turtle Clan. I believe it is Seneca to Tuscarora, I believe. And they were saying, I don't think I should be here. I'm the only Native American in my program. Every time a Native American issue comes up, I feel the pressure to talk about it. But in my tribe, only the elders are supposed to talk about and educate people on these things. So I don't feel like that's my space to do it. Also, there's a place to be held for holding silence is a sacred thing as well too. And in my classes, everyone's just jumping over, talking to one another. I feel like there's no place to do it. If I'm not active enough, people think I don't care. I'm just sitting back. If I'm too active, they think I'm just being the angry Indian, or she's just dealing with a lot right now, and no one takes me as my whole self, my whole person. So I'm wow, that authenticity is that can certainly be. That was just a point they were illustrating, more of a descriptive thing of what kind of Indigenous people can go through during that education. So one point as well to the story and theory I want to share with you all, this is a student song. When I was at Cal State Long Beach for my master's, they had a really strong American Indian student program. with like 67 Native American students at undergraduate, like 20 students active in the council, which was a big bump for me. When I was at Pepperdine, there was like 3 students. Sometimes it was just me on the student council who was Native American or identified. So it's definitely come a long way. So for this right here, it's a student song. What it translates to is, students, though your education is difficult, finish your education because your people are depending upon you. And it's written in Dakota, and you'll hear some things called vocables as well too. So a vocable is, it's not an actual word, it's more of a filler word, but you'll like recognize those from songs like fa la 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 la. It's like, yeah, that's a vocable. It's not a word, but it fills in as well too. So you heard vocables, but it's also the actual translation right here as well too. Should I make it quick? Cousins was actually on that drum, that Elks Whistle drum that gave the song to the school in 1994. So it's pretty fun. Some references, these are all posted on Blackboard as well too. And thank you so much. Y'all want co? If you have any questions, I saw some on Blackboard, so please feel free to ask those right now. And thank you so much for your time.
I'm still going to record if you have questions.
Yeah, please. We still have like 10 minutes of questions. So whatever. I read through them. I try not to touch on them too much. So feel free to jump in right now. And I don't know all the answers by any means, but I'll do my best to help out where I can. Yes.
I'm curious for how a mixed or a multiracial identity would play into this as well. So like yourself, who is multiracial, I think as our students and world become more multiracial, how that might impact this identity theory.
Certainly. I think SDC did a really good job talking about multiracial theory too, and some of them were like Native American as well as other ethnicities as well too. And it is interesting, like kind of this check the boxes, this terminology they use. And when you have to be put in only one box, like, well, I'm this and this, so which one do I put if I can't put one or the other? So I think that definitely is a huge part. I think moving forward, this bridging idea of as the world becomes more multiracial, like how do we do that? So I think you're absolutely right. I think there definitely is a lot more room for studying that.
Have there been any criticisms of like land acknowledgement? I know that I think it was Mei-Zhang, she brought up that like is it ever maybe interpreted as just a hollow statement that's like said at events and that's kind of like the only thing that really happens? Is that something that's talked about at all, or?
Yeah, well, I think definitely that was a great question, really good point. I think that it is, I think, a point I've heard talked about for like the Native community and the non-Native community. I think that definitely for it to be more than a hollow contention, I think you definitely need the intent or like the emotion there, just not just going through the emotions, not just reading off a piece of paper. I think certainly recognizing that. As far as I know, a lot of the Indigenous community, that hey, that's a step in the right direction. Before there was getting no acknowledgement, so that's better than nothing. But certainly, I think that there's definitely more we can do as an institution than just the acknowledgement. But how do you do more than that for every single class? I think that was a very great point you brought up there. Because I've heard some people too is like, well, I heard non-Native students say, well, if we say it every time, doesn't it like lose its power, lose its value? It just seems like we're just saying this because we have to say it plausibly as well too. So I think that. I know Cheryl talks about Conscious Leadership Academy, so I think that the work you do inside as well first, if it matters to you. I know for some of us, we're in 550 learning about integral theory with Ken Wilber and the 4 quadrants. I think if it matters to someone at an individual level, I think that like will in turn kind of change the institution as well too. So I think that it is a step in the right direction, but it definitely it can be. It depends on the person I guess who's saying it. Yes, please.
Did you continue to have the doctor who denied you the
Great question. So that was actually a really tough semester for my undergraduate development. I actually dropped out of college twice. So that was one of my semesters. I dropped out the first time. I was like, you know what, this is just like, it's not working out right now with a lot of things in life. And I dropped the class as well too. And I think it was probably better for it. But it was tough. Most of the texts that we read, everything was from like the 1950s or earlier. It kind of lists as like Native American as a fixated people in the past, like not really occurring now, as kind of like a, for lack of a better word, we're probably like almost like an extinct people, when that's very much not the case. But so it was very tough, but in retrospect, I'm very glad that I kind of made that choice for, if anything, a moral or ethical thing.
Their other question is, like, with the history of boarding schools and majority of us going to higher education and understanding that education was such a big part of like colonization, how do we in higher education like begin to undo that system? Because invisibility is essentially the form of racism that is against the Indigenous community, because they just don't exist. We think that they're not there, but they really are everywhere.
Definitely. No, that's a great point. I think even the invisibility issue, I think like Los Angeles is one of the highest Native American population cities in the United States, but a lot of people don't know that just because you wouldn't assume, and especially like the Latinx community and some Native Americans look very similar as well too, and really these are arbitrary lines of 300 years of colonization. Those were all indigenous people before that as well too. So and how you do that, I think it really is just acknowledgement and recognizing people's history, just recognition, acknowledgement, even just recognizing everyone, because I think that it is hard being this invisible population and feeling like you don't matter, people don't care. I think people do care. I think that if they learn about this, like, oh, that is like sad, that is unjust, and I think that everyone can heal as well too, like by educating everyone about it, or just like I think changing curriculum or state curriculum, like just having people that just be. We learn about Anne Frank, we learn about the Holocaust. Like we learn about California genocide of Native Americans as well too, or just genocide of Native American peoples in general, just so people are more educated about it. You can have an understanding, more of an empathy, or just a context. So I think it starts by the state changing curriculum at the lower level, and then even our higher education, just incorporating it as best you can into whatever subject matter you're having, I think is one way of doing it. Yes?
I'm just curious because I went to the University of British Columbia for undergrad, and I think it was much more progressive in this sense, but then like moving past that, so on campus, excuse me, like a lot of things had already been renamed, and you could be an Aboriginal study major. People were doing that, and it was a huge museum on campus. It's actually quite famous. So it was like really ingrained in the culture there, but even still, like I feel like I left with a general like respect and appreciation, but there was still so much missing from it. So like at that point, what would you?
How to kind of connect
the
it?
next step would be?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think that like, I guess connecting the dots. I mean, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think to a certain point, you can only do so much as short of going mandatory training, and then again, I think at that point, then it potentially could be hollow going through the motions if it's not like chosen, or if someone doesn't actually want to learn about it or partake in that. I think having more Indigenous studies programs and classes available, either adding more professors so you can have even more classes if there's a need for it, having a Native American speaker series. I know the Tribal Liaison Office is doing a great job of getting more speakers on campus, so just being able to educate not only just that population, but like more populations as well too on campus. But I mean, that's a great point you make. I think it, I guess either mandatory training, I guess, but ideally you'd have people who are want to take those, and like just have different opportunities. The speaker series or more classes, I think is one way. Or just having different organizations and clubs where just allies can go as well and learn about it as well too. That's a good question. Don't be shy. No wrong questions. Still got 2 minutes left. Plenty of time. Go for it. I see you thinking. Try it out.
I have a question that I think is the wrong question.
Try it out.
Just in terms of the outdoor adventure space, like we and I, having been traveling and working a lot in New Zealand and working with the Indigenous population of New Zealand, Maori people, when they introduce themselves, they have a practice of introducing themselves and their mountain and their river, and I think that's a beautiful practice, and I like to bring that in a way, and I wonder about when it's me appropriating or when I'm like I like acknowledge, and I sometimes like change it up and just say like, where is a space that like an outdoor space, a place of nature that you connect to. But I wonder about like how, like especially with the outdoors, like, and we're trying to develop an ecological identity with students, but where is the line from being respectful and acknowledging and having that conversation, but also not taking like appropriating a culture.
Yeah. No.
I'm sure that.
No, I think that's a great question, and I think that's a great question to ask and reflect on. I think even in Indigenous think Indigenous populations, sometimes the concern is like, oh, is this like sacred, like what we're sharing, or is this supposed to be there? I think for a lot of people, and I think for a lot of Indigenous systems, they're like recognizing now, like, okay, well, if we don't teach or this isn't shared about, then like we're watching kind of lose it all over. Like when elders or different people who didn't share their stories when they passed away, it's equivalent of libraries being burnt down. It's like, wow, like that just right there is like a language right there, just losing it left and right. So I think a lot of people, I think when it's done out of respect and recognition, acknowledgement, you're not like just stealing the idea and calling it your own by any means, which you're not, right? I think that it sounds like with your deep respect and like recognition, I think that sounds, for me, that sounds like a great thing. Obviously, I'm sure you ask 10 different Native American people, you might get 10 different answers, but I think that, but for me, I'm like, yeah, I think that's a great way of honoring and respecting and bringing that Indigenous knowledge system to part and to like when people use talking circles, not everyone's Native American, but we use those a lot more in academia. But for me, I think that's more of an honoring tradition of saying, wow, like they recognize there's a lot of value in that, and then they're choosing to use that. So I think that by choosing to use that and recognizing and acknowledging, I think that's how you don't appropriate, by just not like stealing ideas, but I think by recognizing the wisdom and honoring that, I think that you're definitely carrying it forward in a great way. Thank you.
I feel like it's a slippery slope when you look at like what's happened with yoga. That yoga is such a, like it feels like there's been some spirituality that has been taken from a culture around yoga that like nobody did intentionally. It was just like, oh yeah, of course we should do this, and then it's just kind of, yeah, how do we balance that?
That's a great point. That's a good example too. Something to think about, definitely. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's a good point. Lauren? Oh yes, please. Last question.
So thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
It could be more questions. That'd be the
Oh,
last
yeah.
one.
It doesn't have to be the last one. I'll just leave my time about you.
No. We're good.
Keep
We're
it coming.
good. We're
Yeah,
good.
we're
We're
good.
good.
Okay. So it's more like a comment, and I think I really like how you incorporated the different forms of knowing, and specifically around silence. Like, what does it mean to be silent, and or just step back and listen to people, and how that's part of. It's very valuable, right? And sometimes I feel like I even might say, oh, this person is so disengaged. But when I'm silent, I'm like, I'm just processing. So a lot of that understanding, specifically when we might teach, when we might lead something, understanding that some people value that very deeply. So, I think that relates to like family too, and like your culture, and what does it mean in your communities or in the classroom, and how do you make them come together? I don't know if I'm going that, because a lot of times critical thinking and discussion is really motivated in the classroom. It's like you have to speak, participation, right? In the classroom, you have to raise your hand and you have to say something. But what does it mean with people from the Native American community? So I don't know, it's just more of a reflection that I'm going through. And how do we honor that without assuming that class participation means speaking all the time? I don't know.
Definitely not. Yeah, I connect with that. Just recognizing how I think in participation we feel like it's just like a quantity, however many times and how long I can speak for. But obviously it's like, well, like I think Cheryl does a great job. Like she recognizes too. Like participate doesn't mean just like speaking the most. Like she'll say, having like quality and respecting that as well too. So Cheryl I think does a great job of kind of recognizing that Indigenous value system. But yeah, I think it is tough of how you mark that, how you grade that. But I think that just having that cultural awareness and recognizing that we're Native American or other people will hold that sacred space of learning in silence and just processing instead of just kind of say ready, fire, aim. Or it's like, oh, if I'm ready, aim, like think about it first. And there's nothing wrong with that as well too, I think, in recognizing that. So yeah, I don't know how you do that other than just I think educating more faculty and administration that that's a way that people process it and they're still participating. I think that's a great point though. So not last question. If there are any more questions, yes.
Okay, I have a question. So part of my role in doing student onboarding is also dealing with the parent side of it. And I think that, and I'm totally guilty of this, like there's the whole notion of the helicopter parents, and like we'll be at orientation and these parents like literally cannot leave and they will follow their students to, we're like, please don't be here, like you're making this awkward, kind of thing. And I've been doing a lot of reading recently on how to differently engage Latinx parents in their children's education, and that's been really impactful for me to think about how maybe the whole idea of like go away, like leave, doesn't work for every family. And I caught that in thinking about how differently to engage Native American families. And do you have any insight into that and what that might look like? Or?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. I think that definitely, I definitely know exactly what you're talking about, helicopter parents and like going and seeing that, and just be like, yeah, like let them grow. But exactly, the opposite point of that, like you think how you do that is, I guess, I think like an individual basis. One good way if you really want to like to honor, if you're trying to build trust, is giving tobacco, which I know sounds, maybe this is a big jump for you, but even just like a pouch of tobacco, or even just like a cigarette, any kind of tobacco. Tobacco across pretty much all Native American people is a huge sign of respect. Is a huge sign of like as a sacred thing, of like one of the most, not even just smoke, not to smoke it, just to have, and like people would put it down like as prayer. Sometimes they would smoke it for ceremony or different things like that. That's what it's used for, but it's also just used for like putting down as prayer. So I think if you ever wanted to like show someone that like you value them, that almost like that, like that's almost like a way of showing like I'm gonna help take over and be part of the family as well too. In like which is a huge jump, a huge thing to do. But I think in part of your role with that onboarding, I think one step is just recognizing, like I guess like through tobacco which seems like a simple thing, but I think most Native American families would very much appreciate that, just feel very honored, respected, and just feel like they're still part of the process, and that like you are recognizing their Indigenous value system too, of like a trusted kind of familiar relation as well too, even just from a small gesture like that. So it seems like it's a weird one in our Western context. You want to give someone a cigarette? That's supposed to help everything. But tobacco is I remember when my grandma, she was writing a letter of recommendation for one of my little nieces, and she was like 6 years old. And she like gave her a little pouch of tobacco, and that's just what you do when you like want to honor someone and like ask for a favor. So I think that I think just trying to honor them, trying to figure out ways, not obviously there's time and a place when you want just the students there, but I think when the families are there, just even trying to just I guess almost speak to all of them. It's like a family unit, because the family is like so important for Native American students, which I think is a different cultural norm. But that is a tough, that's a sticky wicket you have there with as far as between trying to get those balancing those two worlds. So I think balance and respect, and then perhaps incorporating Indigenous traditions as well too, to make them feel honored. That's a great question. Thank you for taking the time to be thinking about those people. Any other questions? All right, y'all have been so respectful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Y'all want to go? And thank you.